Thank you so very much for coming up to this very important and I hope very interesting technical session on the topics in political economy. And for this session, we have, by the way, my name is Manzoor Ahmed, and I am a professor of political economy at Libya University. And currently, I work with the Government of Balochistan as coordinator, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. For this session, we have 4 presenters on very diverse issues and topics. And each presenter has 10 minutes to present. And then I would like to invite later on the very esteemed discussant, Dr. Idris Khwaja and Dr. Aider Nizamani Saab. So I again request all presenters to adhere to the time, which has just 10 minutes to present, and then we will proceed for discussion and question and answer. So the first presenter is Gul Muhammad Rinsab, and he is going to present his paper on a post-colonial critiques on globalization and privatization of education in Pakistan. So, Gul Muhammad Saab, you have 10 minutes to present, please.
So, we have seen due to globalizations, lot of policies has been converged and different countries have adopted policies which is mainly developed in global north, and these policies are being sailed, transformed, whatever they called best practices, these are being shifted to global south. But many scholars view these things are more problematic in context of certain countries like Pakistan. According to Michael J. Young, post-colonial critique focus on forces of oppression and coercive domination that operate in the contemporary world. The politics of anti-colonialism and neo-colonialism, race, gender, nationalism, class, and ethnicities define its terrain. Interest in oppression of past will always be guided by the relationship of the history to the present. So we cannot see globalization just in a fragmented way, but we have to view it from historical perspective, how policies has been developed, how these are being shifted. So according to Arjun Appudrai, central argument against globalization is that its cultural homogenization, westernization, and commoditization. We will see these implications in education as well, because a lot of standardization is coming in education in the form of PISA test, PEARLS, TIMSS. These testing has also been pushed, and that also create more cultural homogenization, which is somehow also kind of oppression in the context of global south, especially Pakistan, because our indigenous culture, our indigenous values of understanding, creation of knowledge is being purely marginalized. Okay, let's go further. Globalization of education, it's more focused on knowledge economy, human capital, and which push global curriculum, and also create the domination of English language. So we will see the globalization comes with also with the role of these international actors like international organizations and non-state actors, which also include NGOs and other philanthropic organizations. These all push privatization of global south, which is unintentionally comes with Western hegemony, because these international organizations think the role of state should be reduced and they can better comfortably work with non-state actors such as NGOs. Let's suppose we can have examples of World Bank and other international organizations, even USAID or DFID, like a UKID, they are more comfortable to work with non-state actors. So Steiner, Comsey, and Johnson, they argued these things are being major interest of these international organizations. What is the impact? This reduced the role of state in education distribution. When we will see the role of state is being reduced in education distribution, then it creates several layers of education. Let's suppose in privatization, we will see different kinds of schooling in Pakistan, and that also create lack of social cohesion, and also within education system, it reproduce inequality. What yesterday we have discussed how our institutions also reproducing inequality. So we will see these all things are coming through globalization and privatization. These post-colonial theorists, these all are non-Western people. They have thought, they all thought that these things should be decolonized. The Western hegemony in education, in social sector should be decolonized. According to Franz Fanon, he was social psychologist. He believed colonial effect still prevail in our mind, in our attitude, in our behavior. So after colonization, definitely all countries become now nation state, but their role are still prevail in our minds, in our so he was arguing that it should be decolonized in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of other things. Edward Said said again, we are seeing Orientalism again in the perspective of Western views. So what we see how global South, or how like South Asian, Pakistan, India, or even Middle East. So we view Orientalism again the perspective of West, not in the perspective of East or indigenous thought. Homi Baba, he was saying, in global South country, we are mimicking the culture of colonizer. Let's suppose we are adopting Western culture, Western whatever. We feel the superiority of West, but still, despite of that mimicking, we are not able to achieve what we thought. If we mimic these culture, we will get what we want. Gayatri Spivak, she's more, her work is more focused on subaltern, especially marginalized women in the context of India and global South. She focused even in our culture. She has taken these ideas subaltern from Gramsci words hegemony. There's a hegemony, and these people are unable to speak their voice. So she focused, we need to develop indigenous voice, and they challenge these norms, these values which marginalize. So post-colonial critique focus on oppression, coercion, domination, new colonialism, and colonial legacy through globalization, what I already discussed. We can also see critically the role of World Bank, IMF, Organization for International, OECD, and other development funds that promote privatization. Definitely, we have seen in context of Pakistan, if we see the Pakistan education policies which is suggested by World Bank, though IMF role is not important in development things, but is still IMF policy of austerity. Let's suppose IMF suggests some certain policy on countries like Pakistan, you have to limit your budget. If they limit their budget, they definitely, these things move toward private sector. Policy again flow from global north to global south in terms of even in higher education, K-12 education. I think I have a limited time. I'm going quick. Many scholars believe globalization and post-colonialism have same conceptual ground, because both these things oppress local culture, indigenous values. So empire justify imperialism through alignment and development of citizen. Same thing we will see in terms of globalization. In terms of privatization, they say, okay, this will promote development. We are investing money. We are giving money, but unintentionally, these things also create inequality within the system. In terms of knowledge production and best practices, we are using Western thoughts. Let's suppose in impact evaluation, mostly we use randomized control trial. In randomized control trial, we have a control group and intervention group. We disregard other factors such as culture, what mechanism which enable to give that result. We also rule out, for example, those people who are not coming in particular samples. Even Eurocentric hegemony, cultural violence and superiority, neoliberalism, market system, within these values, we are creating more elite culture and marginalization. You can look at the education system of Pakistan. There are a lot of marginalization. Only few people are getting succeed, and we have to seriously think on it. So this is just brief history of Pakistan. We have a different school system, even English medium, madrasas. Again, through NGOs, we are also getting some other kind of schools. This is pure colonial replications. Let's suppose we have separate schools for ruling elite, even bureaucrat, politician, and armed forces, and there's a government school system for common people. And in the end, these these schools reproduce whatever cultural hegemony. So we have also to view knowledge critically, because knowledge is instrumental in colonization and aftermath. European type of English conflict. Even we have also our own Islamic culture values, but even our national education policy focus on that our Islam should be our central themes of education, but we are not going to get it. So there is a need for indigenous and contextualized policies in education. These education policies should not be framed or developed by these whatever organizations are discussed, World Bank or DFID, other, but these policies should be purely discussed and formed indigenously, and we should be more skepticism toward development discourses pushed by these international organizations. And we have to develop local resistance of such policies which marginalize, oppress, and create elites, because that's a very important. I think I'm done with my presentation. If you have any.
Thank you so very much. We will come later for the question and answer.
Later?
Yeah. The next presenter is Safiya Hussain, and she is from the University of Sheffield and Abib University, and she is going to speak on sanctions and an evil or ethical tool. Please.
Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Today I'll be presenting my research on sanctions, an ethical or evil tool. So sanctions are basically defined in many ways. There's so many definitions, and everywhere you look at, people define them very differently. So sanctions are seen as tools of punishment for forceful diplomacy and economic coercion. However, for this study, I basically took the definition that sanctions are tools implemented by sender states for the target states, basically to bring about a policy change in the country. So these changes could range from many factors, such as a change in the dictatorial regime, a change in a policy, and many more. So one of the reasons why I did this study was to test why these tools are so commonly used and why they're so used in such a they're used in our everyday lives now. And since these tools are so common, I just wanted to study whether they're effective or not. So that's what I did. That's why I decided to do the study. Furthermore, I also looked at the effectiveness of smart sanctions over traditional ones. So the rationale for my study was that since these tools are so important, we should understand where they're coming from, and we should understand why they're imposed. Also, studies like this help us understand why sanctions are important, or if they're important at all. And also, they make us understand if we actually need a more humanitarian approach, or if there's an alternate approach that is needed to sanctions. Other than that, one of the things that I found out while researching this topic was that studying sanctions is very important, because it brings us to understand why, how the highbrow culture takes place in there's highbrow politics that takes place in the international arena. And there's a lot of things that happen in the international arena where superpowers actually end up misusing their powers to basically harm the target countries by using sanctions. So that's one thing that came out as a result of my study as well, and I think it's a very important rationale. So the literature review. There's a lot of literature on sanctions. I tried my best to pick pick authors from both sides of the spectrum, people who support sanctions and people who do not. So Gordon and Weiss talk about how sanctions are actually not so helpful in curbing human rights violations. They also talk about how sanctions worsen the economic situations in the countries they're imposed in. And also, Gordon goes on to say how sanctions affect the weaker nations more, because a lot of times they are imposed on the weaker nations by a bunch of powerful states. Also, sanctions have been compared to punishment involvement in wars. A lot of authors argue that sanctions are basically a prelude to war. Sometimes wars happen after sanctions are imposed, and a lot of them actually say that sanctions are actually worse than wars, because when wars take place, you have the Geneva Conventions, you have certain political protocols in the international arena that protect the people who are suffering from wars, but there's no proper protocols or conventions in place for people who are suffering under sanctions. So Nossel talks a lot about this, and he basically says how sanctions are worse than wars in that sense, because there's no protection for the people who are suffering under them. Moving on, sanctions are also known to create a rally around the flag effect, which is when they're imposed on a dictatorial regime, the dictator ends up using them for his own means and instead gathers the population under him. So this is an important aspect of sanctions as well. Moving on to the side of the spectrum who actually support the sanctions. So Hoffner, Schott, and Elliott basically argue in their research that sanctions are important for bringing an end to human rights violations if they're used in a more ethical way or if they're more targeted. Other people also share the same vision, and the idea of smart sanctions is something that's becoming more and more common in the world today because people argue that sanctions should be made more humane, more effective, and their overall more humane and more effective. So smart sanctions are becoming more and more common because people believe that if smarter sanctions are imposed, they target the perpetrators and hit the real ones instead of hitting the local populations who suffer the most. Moving on to the methodology, I used the case studies of Libya and Iraq for my study, and then I decided on a bunch of questions that I developed myself by reading the works of Gordon, Weiss, and Baldwin. The questions that I used were, did the human rights violation come to an end after the sanctions were imposed? Were the sanctions imposed alone, or was any other method used? Did the sanctions have long-lasting impacts on the country's population? Were these impacts good or bad? Did the sanctions result in infant mortality, scarcity of essential resources, and unemployment? All these questions basically help us answer the fact whether sanctions were effective or not. So moving on to the case of Libya. The sanctions in Libya were introduced in 1986 after a bunch of terrorist attacks where the Libyan government was found responsible. And then in 1988, the United Nations also decided to sanction Libya because of their involvement in terrorist activities. After that, there was a ban on their imports, exports, government programs. Their foreign assets were also frozen. And also, a lot of the things that Libya needed for its energy sector to function better were also restricted as well. So all of these things, the United Nations and the United States combined together to basically restrict all these things in Libya. Libya's economy barely grew during this time. Libya's economy grew around 0.8% from 1992 to 1999, and the healthcare went down from 60.3 million in 1980s to 4.6 million in 1993. This shows us that the sanctions did affect the country in such a way that a lot of their budgets were restricted. So basically, the case of Libya is considered a case of smart sanctions and a case of successful sanctions. However, despite the fact that the sanctions were successful, and the only reason they say that the sanctions were successful was because Libya decided to no longer indulge in terrorism or no longer be involved in terrorist activities. However, it is essential to note that despite the success of these sanctions, Libya was later sanctioned by the United Kingdom, and it still faces sanctions today from many countries because of different reasons. So this brings us to question the efficiency of sanctions and whether they're sustainable in the long run. Because if the sanctions are being imposed and then removed, and then there's a different sanction, is the main goal really achieved? That brings us to question this as well. Moreover, the Libyan population suffered the most under these sanctions, and even so moving on to the case of Iraq. So the United Nations basically decided to sanction Iraq when it decided to invade Kuwait, and then as a result of these sanctions, their assets were frozen, and a lot of the companies were prohibited from investing in their energy sector, in their oil sector, and doing business with the country. And then after Iraq refused to withdraw from Kuwait, it resulted in a Gulf War. And then after the Gulf War, in 2003, United States also decided to sanction Iraq. And one of the reasons for the United States sanction was that they wanted to remove Saddam Hussein from power and also to basically destroy the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq possessed. However, many studies have shown that Iraq at this time did not possess any weapons, and they did not exist. So this brings us to question why these sanctions took place when such a massive, this brings us to question why these sanctions took place when there were no weapons of mass destruction. So the Iraqi economy really suffered during this time because Iraq used to import 70% of its food, medicines, and chemicals from agriculture before these sanctions were imposed. So of course, this population suffered massively. And the malnutrition rates were so high in the country that the UN themselves had to put a program called the Oil for Food program, and basically which allowed Iraq to get food for their children. Studies have also shown that more children died in the war in Iraq than they did in the 2 atomic bombs and the ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia combined. This shows us the massive impact of these sanctions on Iraq, and it brings us to question, were these sanctions really needed? Because they did more damage than the wars themselves. So the main conclusions and recommendations that I would like to give as part of my study are that if sanctions are to be used as a tool for international diplomacy, they should be made more smart. And alternatives should be studied, and we should try to come up with better alternatives. There should be better regulation, because people should be held accountable for their motives, and we should also have an international community to ensure that the target countries the sender countries are also being checked, to ensure that whether the sender countries have the right motives, and if the sanctions are actually reaching their purpose as well. And other than that, the sender states should also all be on the same page when sanctions are being imposed, because in the case of Iraq, a lot of the times UN had different goals, US had different goals, which is why there was a lot of more chaos and a lot of more destruction in the country. So this basically brings us to question all the institutions in power, and also we just need to have more regulation and research on sanctions before they're imposed, and we need to look for more alternatives or to make them more smarter. The drawbacks of the study were the fact that I used case studies, which sometimes ignores the on-ground realities because an academic perspective is present. And the other drawback for the study was that I used data from the UN, from international organizations and newspapers. Sometimes this data can be over or understated because of biases, but I tried my best to cover this by using the methods of triangulation and basically confirming my data from various sources. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you had a good time.
Thank you so very much, Safiya, for that wonderful presentation. Now, I would like to ask our next presenter, who is Dr. Mir Sadat Baloch. Dr. Sadat is leading a think tank based in Quetta, Balochistan Council for Peace and Policy, and he also works as a research and policy specialist with the government of Balochistan. And Dr. Sadat is going to speak on improving public sector development program in Balochistan, a study of health, education, communication and works, and social welfare departments. Please.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Manzoor, for the introduction. Before starting the presentation, I would just like to create a perspective to put the things in perspective, and let's look at this picture. In Balochistan, more than 30% children are born premature, and they are also undernourished, malnourished, or stunted. And the government is supposed to provide them health facilities through the Psdp that they have. But usually, most of the parents, they end up in private hospitals like this to save their children. So I thought that the Psdp of Balochistan has been a political bone of contention for last 4 years, and successive year the opposition has gone to courts. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that these are our lawmakers. They are the opposition people who are trying to stop the budget from happening, because they thought that the Psdp that the government has made, it is not fair. And it is not fair because the political clientelism that they want to sustain in Balochistan, it was not being met by the government at that time. And right after this budget, then our chief minister was removed because of the Psdp. And the objective of this study was not only to understand that what are the issues with Psdp and what is the influence of the political leverage on it, but the main focus was to suggest effective ways for resource allocation in Balochistan. And what we did in research was that we have produced a financial model, and we have also produced a matrix which will help the government in Psdp allocation in future, and we'll discuss that further. So we selected 10 districts of Balochistan, 5 districts who were performing good on multi-poverty index, and 5 districts who were at the bottom. We couldn't do it in whole of the Balochistan, and we couldn't take all the departments. So we took, and let me tell you that this data is underreported, because there are districts in Avaran, Mashke, and their data was not collected, so they have not mentioned them in it. So this data is underreported, but this is the data that we had, and we picked that data. So we used a mixed method, and we interviewed people in 10 districts of the 4 departments that were mentioned before, and then we used their responses to create a performance matrix that would rank the projects, and I'll give an example in a while. And the secondary data was obtained from all the departments about their PSDPs for last 10 years, and then we did our analysis on it. The first model that we tried to create, and we wanted to make this model more inclusive, but there were some limitations. The first was that there have never been any impact analysis on any project that has happened in Balochistan. So because of that, we could not include that. And secondly, we really wanted to see that if there is a per capita income for all the districts in Balochistan, but due to the limitation of data, we couldn't do it. And this is the second. In first, we are telling that each department how much they should get in the PSDP. So you just put the amount of the PSDP, and it will tell you that how each district should get. And then after districts, we have also proposed the model that how much each department should get. Then this is the multi-criteria decision analysis. It's a tool that has been there for more than 50 years. Basically, it has been used more in environmental studies in America or in Europe, and we try to adapt it for our research. And I'll give an example of that. So this is the analysis of the 10 districts. If you see, so when we started our research, we thought that maybe Quetta is getting more attention because it is the capital of Balochistan. But during our research, we realized that what happens in PSDP allocations in Balochistan, that it is allocated on the basis of MPAs. So Quetta has 10 MPAs, so they are getting a lot of funds. Then same way, Khuzdar has around 3 MPAs, and Killa Abdullah. So if you look at Harnai and Ziyarat are 2 districts, but they have 1 MPA. So their funds are distributed over there. And then there is another factor as well, that all the districts that you see that are getting less funds, they were either in the opposition at the time when we were doing this analysis, and because of that also they couldn't get. So clearly it shows that there is a very large skewedness that how PSDP is being allocated. And our qualitative findings were that the process is influenced by political power, that if you see our paper, we have mentioned as the political clientelism, and it is so much influence that I was interviewing one department, and they told me that we were asked to conduct a feasibility for a project, and when we went to that area and we checked it, and we came back and we told our higher-ups that that area lies in Afghanistan, but they said no, we have to do this project over there. And then secondly, it is not that the MPAs they'll get most of the projects. All the influential people who are even not in power, they will get their projects included in the PSDP. And the process is so non-participatory that all the districts that we visited and we interviewed, deputy commissioners, and let me tell you that there were 2 districts where the deputy commissioner was so scared that they refused to give us interview. They said, "Yaar, kyun aap hamari naukari ke piche pade hue?" So this shows the clout of the political people who are living there. And it doesn't stop here. There are also issues with the implementation. All the districts that we visited, there were many projects that were running for last 10 years, and they were still not completed. Apart from this, there were projects when a building is completed and the departments, they don't know that which department is supposed to take up that building. उनको पता ही नहीं होता था कि either it is for health department or education or any other, because the MPAs, they just sit with their own people and they make their projects and they give them all the projects. And of course, there is a lack of transparency and accountability because of which this is all happening. So we made this matrix. In this matrix, we have identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors, and we have given weightage to each factor. First is that how a district is performing on MPI. So if it's Quetta, which is on the top, so it will only get 10 points for it. And then we also see that how much funds has been allocated to each districts in last 10 years, the history. And if Quetta has been given the highest, so it will also only get 10 numbers. And then we'll see that the infrastructure that is necessary to for any project such as water, roads, electricity or gas. If that is there, then we'll give them full score. If it is not there, so we have given it a weightage of 33% to each. And then the project prerequisites. By project prerequisites, we mean that if we want to establish a high school in any districts, there should be at least 5 to 6 primary schools, and then you can go for a high school. And if you need to establish a college, there should be feeding schools, and then you can establish a college over there. So we wanted that project prerequisites and that either they are there or not. And then there are also project risks in Balochistan. In Dera Bukti, there is one girls' school that has not been constructed. It's now almost 14 years, because the land which was allocated to them, 2 tribes are still fighting that it is our land and we should be given the money. And whenever the government try to start their work over there, so then and apart from this, there are many encroachments that happen, and we have taken into consideration the project risks. If the risk is high, we give them zero.
Sadat, sorry to interrupt. Can you please conclude in 2 minutes?
All right. So you see, in this way, we have ranked all the projects, and this example is for a health department hospital, that if you want to, there are 5 districts, and you can see that the P3, the project 3 has the highest score in it. So it will create a balance for the government. And the recommendation is that right now the districts are not taken into account, so they should be taken into account, and they should use our multi-criteria decision matrix for the allocation, because in that way it can be more transparent. And we also say that the allocation should be without any biases, because what is happening right now, that Quetta is the only main urban center of Balochistan, and people are migrating towards it, and Quetta has got overstretched, and we don't know that what will happen in 5 or 10 years. So we need to see that these urban biases are taken into consideration. And furthermore, each district's local government body should be included, and the government should also include the public in the process, because the public, they have no idea that what is happening and why it is happening, because of which there is a very huge trust deficit. And so I end my presentation here. Thank you.
So very much, Dr. Sadat, for that very thought-provoking and interesting presentation and work. Our last presentation is by Dr. Muhammad Tahir. He is going to join us on Zoom. And his paper is on the moderating role of terrorism on the insurance growth relationship. some evidence from the 15 MENA economies. Yeah, I think he's not online, yeah. So should we proceed for the discussion? Okay, so the last presenter is not online. He was supposed to join us through Zoom. And now I would like to ask the discussant, Dr. Idris Khwaja and Aidan Azamani Saab. So can I please ask you to come? Dr. Aidan Azamani Saab, and may I request you to come here and discuss the papers, please?
Well, thank you very much. And I would be very brief and give more kind of the time to Idris Saab to discuss two papers that he had picked. And basically, I'm going to restrict my comments or some input to Safia's paper, which was, I mean, like, as I understand, I thought that it was a working paper, sort of a work in progress, and had a quick chat with her, and turns out to be that indeed it was her master's dissertation that she plans to revise and make it or then submit it for a peer-reviewed journal. So my comments would be more kind of, say, I hope they are constructive, but in that spirit. So we know that sanctions, it is, I'll just focus on maybe 2 or 3 points. One is that, as Safia said, that her purpose of her study was to see whether sanctions, looking at their effectiveness for curbing human rights violations and the net effect of those sanctions on the populations on which they are imposed. Now, I think the key question, and both the case studies that you picked, to the best of my knowledge, the sanctions that were imposed either on Libya or in Iraq, their stated objective was not to ensure or promote human rights in those countries. So I think that in case of Libya, it was of course more about Gaddafi regime's international policies and how it sponsored quote unquote terrorism, and I put that in double quotation marks because that word itself, it needs to be problematized. It need not to be taken at face value. So the one thing is that probably in this paper, that is one thing is that you need to kind of maybe think through and straighten out that if the stated objectives of the sanctions, if it was not ensuring or promoting human rights, and then if we are judging the effectiveness of sanctions to see whether they ensured human rights or not, that may be kind of say a little knot that you have to kind of say untie. And the second thing is that this phrase of smart sanctions, quote unquote traditional sanctions and smart sanctions. Smart sanctions, to me, I haven't studied that literature in depth, but it looks like it is more of what George Orwell in that famous essay was talking about double speak, where the words basically are used to create euphemism or desensitize. So basically they have exactly, at times, they have exactly the opposite impact than the word suggests. So the word smart sanctions, it is almost as troubling as smart bombs, right? When we look at the sanctions, and of course, I mean, like say the sanctions are imposed when in what international relations we call the deterrence, when the deterrence fails, right? So then the sanctions are imposed. If the deterrent is working properly, there's no need for sanctions. So it is the failure of deterrence, then the sanctions come into play, and it's a very, very slippery slope to expect something that is coercive, that is violent, I mean, like say, violent perpetrated through deployment of arms or through economic means, to have humane face to it. So that may be, academically speaking, in terms of coming up with, you can say, the nice recommendations, it may be very fine, but is there essential contradiction in that? That, I mean, something that is supposed to punish, how can that have humane and non-coercive kind of impact? So those will be few submissions that I'll make. I think, I mean, like say, you have, the paper has covered a lot of ground in terms of literature review. It's case studies. They are kind of, say, I think, for any such a study, they are apt examples. They are recent and all that. But probably in order to make this working paper or master's dissertation, revise it for a journal submission, attending to, maybe I've given some either constructive or non-constructive feedback, attending to some of those points, and straightening out those I would say the creases in the paper. Once it is ironed out, I have no doubt that it's a very important topic, and with a little bit of revision, it stands a very good chance to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Thank you very much. And because the other paper I was supposed to talk about, since we couldn't get the presentation, so it would be futile of me to be talking about the paper about which we didn't even hear that. So I'll pass it on to Idrissa.
Thank you, Nizamuddin. Idrissa, please, for the two papers.
Thank you, IBA, for inviting me to discuss these two important papers. So I will first start with the PhD paper by Mr. Saadat Baloch. So it's a very good attempt to structure the allocation of Psdp according to some formula and according to some mechanisms. And Saadat Sahab has done a good exercise on advising us a formula regarding this. So let's begin. I would directly go to the first, the formula that Saadat Sahab is advising us. The two main elements of the formula that he is suggesting is that population and area. So one of the things to account for is, Saadat Sahab, I would say that there are a number of factors. What you are referring is to how much allocation should go to a district. But there could be a number of projects that would benefit more than one district. For example, Gawadar. That would not even that would benefit not only the province but even the country at the national level. So we cannot just look at the district factors. We have to take into account other factors as well. This would be, and these would get priority because, for example, take the case of Rikodik. So now some infrastructure might be required in that area, in that district, in whatever district the Rikodik is located, because on a priority basis, roads and all that area. Or take the case of Sui. Wherever the Sui is located, that may require more development funds relative to others. So we have to look into one of the factor, I would say, is that factors that are beyond the level of the district, and these could be national factors, these could be provincial factors or whatever. So perhaps what would be that, yes, there should be allocation for each district, but just as in case of NFC, there is allocation for the provinces, and there is some of the tasks are left to the central government or to the federal government. The dams, the highways, etc., are constructed by the federal government. So similarly, in case of Psdp, there should be some block allocation maybe for the province, and the province should decide that what are the projects that are inter-district that would benefit more than one district. Now, as far as against that criteria matrix is concerned, the matrix is very useful. That, for example, you are considering what are the prerequisites, what are, for example, if you are saying that if there is a college, then there should be a school as well. These are important factors. But again, one of the factors that you need to consider is also the importance and the return. For example, what you can do is that what would be the economic return of the project? What could be the financial return of the project? And it could again be at the national level, it could be at the provincial level. So, I think that if these factors are accounted for, it would become, your formula would become more robust, but the idea of having a formula is very good, and I comment for that. As far as the influence of political factors is concerned, we need to go first into the rationale, whether or not politics should be there or not. As far as the rationale is concerned, it's not bad, having political factors influence on the Psdp is not bad if the politics is going all fine, because you yourself are suggesting of having a participatory approach, and the participatory the politicians are basically the representative of the people. But it's another matter that in actual practice this may not be happening. So, the real politics, what is politics in theory and what is politics in practice is different. So, yes, we need to account for other factors, but as far as taking into account the views of the deputy commissioner are concerned, basically that is also again means that taking in views of the government. That is not, deputy commissioner would not be representative of the public. That is another matter that yes, deputy commissioner is more aware of the local factors, but still he would be representing the government, not the public. It's the politicians who represent the public, not the deputy commissioner. So, if these all factors are accounted for, and again it is very good that you have documented the process of Psdp, though at the federal level at least this is quite well known that all these factors go into account, are taken in account, but it's very good to document this process because this would be useful for the readers as well. So, these are my basic comments on the Psdp paper. The next paper was on globalization of education. Regarding globalization of education, I would say that it's a good effort to take into account what are the flaws with our education, but I'm tempted to comment and take a quote from Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, that dear Brutus, the fault lies not with our stars, the fault lies with us. So, it's not the fault of the globalization. Yesterday, in the last session of urbanization, we heard quite a few people who were, you can say, were the beneficiary of the elite schools. But they were talking about the problems of Gwadar, they were talking about problems of Gujarnala, and they were talking about problems of Okada farm. So, all that global education is not bad. It might be giving us some useful inputs for our local problems. If you have to start with the global education came, the Beacon House, the city school and all that came because our public schools were not functioning. Our public schools were not yielding the good product. That's it's our public school system that gave space for this global system. So, and this is just not in case of education. Governance, public sector is not performing anywhere, not just in education. So, if public sector is fine, then probably we can take an issue with the global education. But as far as global education is concerned, and in most of cases, not in social sciences, yes, you can take an issue that they are affecting our culture, etc. But as far as physics, mathematics, etc. is concerned, whether it's global or it's local, it's the same. Human anatomy is not different in America and in Pakistan. So, but there would be a number of other factors why we have not been able to spend enough on education. And if we have been able to spend, why we have not been able to secure enough returns for these. And there would be a number of governance issues and all that involved. And this first we'll need to look into those factors, and then probably we can take an issue with the global education. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Idris Saab. So we have a couple of minutes for questions and comments from the audience, please. So if there is any question.
Thank you. All the papers were really interesting. So I just had a comment for the paper on sanctions. I was just listening to the paper, and also Dr. Nizamani's comments are completely on point. I don't know if it's a suggestion that you would want to take or not, but as Dr. Nizamani pointed out, that the purpose of the sanctions is different, but sanctions are often imposed as a product of a dyadic relationship rather than just a unilateral action. So, for example, the US will impose a different kind of sanction on one state versus the other state. So a lot of the literature on sanctions actually doesn't use unilateral sanctions anymore. The analysis is always done on the dyad. So both countries, the ones that are imposing and then the ones that are receiving. So I think that might be an interesting element to include in the analysis. And also the case studies, I think, are, because this is obviously a work in progress, so this is great, but it would be nice to add a couple of other case studies also where there are other countries that also impose sanctions. European sanctions are very different from North American sanctions, for example. Also, I completely agree with the idea that the smart sanctions are not just sanctions that, we all know that sanctions have a negative effect on human rights. So smart sanctions is when, if the purpose of the sanction is to get the regime, then it's targeted enough and it gets the regime. So I think redefining that a little bit, but overall it was an interesting paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Leila. Sir?
Yes, just to continue on the same theme, probably whole of the global world these days, they are after sanctions, especially after Russia. And you know, instead of helping to reduce the miseries, it is adding to the miseries of, you know, not only to Russians, the Ukrainians, but it is also adding, as the keynote speaker this morning said, that it is going to affect globally the supplies of energy and inflation and commodity pricing. So what I feel is that, you know, we need to have a global order where we need to bring in Russia, we need to bring in North Korea, many of other countries. So sanctions may not be that a very, it should be the last option because we have seen that instead of helping, it is trying to, and even they say that in case of Pakistan, we faced a lot of sanctions in, during 80s and 90s. Although it somehow it helped us to have some sort of self, you know, reliance and that sort of direction. But I think that with a lot of efforts, the communities, the global community has developed a trade and services, you know, sort of global order. So by having sanctions, we are again going back to the Cold War era of sort of slowing down the economy. And so I think we need to find from today's discussion something robust, futuristic way out of these conflicts. And in century 21st, you know, these wars, I think we have to revisit the whole global order. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Question in the back, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My questions to Ms. Safia. Why not you have added the country Iran, because they have a lot of sanctions from these bodies. So, and you have only included Iraq and Libya. So why not Iran?
Okay.
What is your rationale behind this? Thank you.
So as I mentioned that this is a work in progress, so of course more case studies can definitely be added. Moving on, Iran was not added because the case of Libya is considered as a case of smart sanctions, and I wanted to question why it's considered smart sanctions, so of course Libya was chosen. And the case of Iraq was chosen because of the wars that took place, the Iraqi Freedom Operation and the Gulf War. So basically when you're doing a paper, you obviously have some word limits as well that you need to adhere to. So of course I could not pick the entire list of countries that were sanctioned. And of course there are countries like Iran as well that should be studied, but I mean there are other researchers out there to study them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other question?
Again, just an observation. Thank you. I think most of these sanctions are very politically motivated, which have an economic and are supposed to have an economic and a humane impact, unfortunately. So having said that, another thing is that I would just like to maybe connect it with something which we had in a prior session. Maybe it's just a thinking that when you give cash transfers or money to households and stuff like that, whereas you've seen in societies such as, for example, Iran and all that, it has made them more resilient. They've come up with resources and opportunities and ideas how to survive and sustain. So I think there is maybe a connection there where you could say, okay, there were sanctions on these, but how did they survive and sustain and adapt compared to societies where they're not doing well and you end up giving them these these kind of monies. So that's just a small connection. Maybe it might make sense to you or not, but it was good to hear you out on that one. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Sadat and Gul Saab, if you'd like to sort of respond to the comments in 1 or 2 minutes that we are left with.
I thank Idris Saab for his very productive comments. I just like to add that we wanted to add the economic value impact, but as I said during my presentation, that in Balochistan there has never been any impact analysis of any project. This is one of the reasons that we couldn't add that to our formula. And secondly, we also tried to look for a GDP of each district, which can give us a picture of the economic outlook of each district, and that was also not available. So yeah, as you said, these are very important, but sadly in Balochistan we don't have that much data, and because of which I understand that my research could not create the clout that it should have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gulsab.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to comment on Dr. Idris said globalization has definitely some benefits in terms of natural science. But I think we should see globalization and its impact critically, because if we apply post-colonial lens, I think globalization is marginalizing severely certain countries, like especially in Pakistan. We have example of Finland, which is immune from global education reform movement, and they are performing very well in terms of education, because mostly we have seen these policies are being developed in global north, and these are being pushed in global south as a best practices, and they are adding more testing in education, more standardization of education. I think these things have some serious implication. Let's suppose now UN have developed sustainable development goals. The sustainable development goals means all people thrive equally, but we have seen our education system is reproducing inequality, and it still there's a question on social cohesion. Let's suppose we feel Pakistan as a nation state and it has its own vision, how it adopts certain values and practices, but if there's a more fragmented approach in education policy development, and there are different actors which operate in education policy making, I think these things should be critically viewed, and this should be bring in the part of discussion and discourse analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you all presenters for presenting very interesting and wonderful papers. And I thank you, sir, for your very valuable comments, and Dr. Idris Saab for his wonderful comments on those two papers. So that's all for this session. And thank you all once again for coming up to this session. Thank you.